Welcome everybody to our Christmas celebration. And think about it, there's a whole lot to celebrate. I'm kind of proud of our country and our culture for making this such a big tradition that has its own theme music. We have imagery like It's a Wonderful Life and Elf and Cousin Eddie. I mean, come on, that's just great stuff. And you have Linus quoting from the Christmas story. I mean, all these things are really wonderful. I think it brings out the best in us. That's a strong suit. It encourages us to be more generous, kind of more polite and loving towards one another during the season. That's kind of what it's known for. And that's its strong suit. The problem is, though, it can also kind of have a weak point. And I mean tradition does. I love having those same images every year. The problem is with tradition is it's one of those things that if you hear it so much, you kind of don't hear it at all. You ever walked into your house like after you've been gone on a vacation for like a week or two and you like, does it always smell like that? You kind of get nervous, right? Because you know that you're used to whatever smell is in there, and so it has to be fresh again to you before you can really smell the way it is. But tradition can be that way, right? The other problem that we've been exploring during this month is these things can sound kind of unreal. That story, as cute as it is, whenever Linus quotes it, I think in our minds sometimes we can begin it once upon a time. And in the original, it doesn't begin that way. The words that Linus quoted, the author of those words, he began the story this way. Listen how he starts it. Many have undertaken to draw up an account of the things that have been fulfilled among us, just as they were handed down to us by those who were from the first eyewitnesses and servants of the word. With this in mind, since I myself have carefully investigated everything from the beginning, I too decided to write an orderly account for you, most excellent Theophilus, so that you may know the certainty of the things that you have been taught. He begins the story of Christmas with words like eyewitness, carefully investigated, and certainty. And we're not used to hearing those kinds of words, especially associated with things from the Bible or stories like the Christmas story. But that's how he began it. Luke is considered actually a first-rate historian by people who may not necessarily believe. They may be skeptical. But you need to hear what one archaeological expert says about Luke. Listen to this, quote, "The general consensus of both liberal and conservative scholars is that Luke is very accurate as an historian. He's erudite, he's eloquent, his Greek approaches classical quality, he writes as an educated man, and archaeological discoveries are showing over and over again that Luke is accurate in what he has to say." Luke is traditionally viewed as he's a physician, and he would have been educated for that day and very careful about what he wrote. That's why he uses those terms of carefully investigated. So when you're reading this Christmas story, even the one we've heard so much, you're hearing someone who's really thinking through what he's seen and reporting it to you as accurately as he knows how. And that's very important to remember. And so as we go into the Christmas story that we traditionally know it, you need to remember that. See, we've been studying the last couple of weeks before now, Luke chapter 1. Today, we're going to start at Luke chapter 2, and it's where the most famous reporting of the Christmas story is. But actually, the way it begins is kind of boring, a little bit dry, but listen to what it says. In those days, Caesar Augustus issued a decree that a census should be taken of the entire Roman world. Now, this was the first census that took place while Quirinius was governor of Syria. And everyone went to their own town to register. So Joseph also went up from the town of Nazareth in Galilee to Judea, to Bethlehem, the town of David, because he belonged to the house and the line of David. He went there to register with Mary, who was pledged to be married to him, and he was expecting a child. Okay, again, that's some dry stuff, but here's what's very critical. Remember, Luke is the historian. He's giving you time, places, and people. Real time, real places, real people. And that's critical to important. First of all, he gives you a time orientation. He mentions Caesar Augustus. Now, what you need to know about Caesar Augustus, and here's an image of him. Caesar Augustus was the first true emperor and dictator of the Roman Empire. He was related to Julius Caesar, and he took over the empire. And what he did was he gave the known world at that time the greatest peace it had ever known as a ruler. Wars had been going on, and all kinds of violence had been going on, and he was able to, through his governance, to create more peace than people had been used to seeing. So when he issued a decree, it got done. And that's the world into which Jesus was born. Now, he reigned for about 40 years, from 27 BC to 14 AD, and it's in that territory that Jesus was born. Now, why he mentions the governor of Syria is that he's just zooming in the time on that 40 years, kind of squeezing it in, saying, okay, it was during the census that happened while this guy was governor. So this little 3-year period. So the person reading this could say, oh yeah, I know exactly when you're talking about. That's very, very important. And then, you may not know this, but Luke, as an historian, throughout the centuries has been doubted off and on. Scholars have pushed back against him, and they haven't found archaeological confirmation of what he reported. And one of those examples is this census. A lot of people have cast doubt on it. Scholars throughout the years have said they wouldn't have had people go to their hometowns. That's a myth. It didn't happen. But what's happened over and over with Luke, and this is an example, is they'll keep digging and they'll keep looking and they'll find things that confirm what he said after all. And this happened with a document that they found not terribly long ago that was dated in the 2nd century. Listen what it says, quote, Gaius Vibius Maximus, prefect of Egypt, that's who's writing it, seeing that the time has come for the house-to-house census, it is necessary to compel all those who for any cause whatsoever are residing out of their provinces to return to their own homes, that they may both carry out the regular order of the census and may also attend diligently to the cultivation of their allotments. Official way of saying, Luke was telling us the truth. That's how Rome did their census stuff. They would have people go back to the town of your origin. Now imagine you're Joseph and Mary and you live in the northern part of Israel and you get that decree. And they don't say, it doesn't say when they traveled, but the implication is that she was later on in her pregnancy, that very soon after she got to Bethlehem, she had a baby. My wife has given birth to 3 children. And I've noticed this pattern. This is how it usually went. Maybe it's not this way for all women, but this is what I observed. Early pregnancy, body's adjusting, sickness, not a very, very fun time. But there enters a time where there's actually an enjoyment in it. You know, they can feel the baby, and there's sort of this thing of just beauty, right? But then late in the pregnancy, about 8.5 months, there comes this baby's got to get out of me now. I've got to get this baby out of my body. You know, it's just, I can't stand this. And it's possible that they were traveling during that time. Now here's an image of, they lived in Nazareth in the northern part of Israel, and they had to go down to Bethlehem, and there was a traditional trade route that was taken, and that would have been roughly 90 miles, which is the equivalent of walking from Evansville or Henderson to Louisville, Kentucky, in that condition. And you know, that had to be tough, and they were used to walking, but at the same time, having that kind of challenge would have been an interesting journey, to say the least. I can't help but picture them in my mind too. You know, the attitude of the whole country would have been not very good, because they have to go take this census, and it was for taxation, and no one liked that, and no one liked the Romans either from their country. And so, I don't know if Joseph and Mary were that way or not, but they had to do this journey. And I also wonder, she was controversially pregnant, if you will, and maybe they had been ostracized by their family. They would have traveled by family otherwise, but maybe, just maybe, they were just traveling alone. We don't know. But I wonder what the conversations might have been between this young man and this young woman. But then finally, and here's probably the most important thing you need to know, is that these real people at a real time were going to a real place called Bethlehem. Now what's interesting about Bethlehem is that Jewish people of that day, when they heard Bethlehem, they would have thought town of David first. But secondly, they would have thought of sheep, sacrificial sheep. In other words, many of the sheep that were sacrificed at the temple, which wasn't very far away in Jerusalem, were raised in that area. And what's important to note about that is that the Bible does that all the time. It gives you real history, real time, real places. But when it talks about Jesus, it layers in all this amazing meaning that every single part of his life was associated with his call to be the Savior, to be that sacrificial lamb who was given for the sins of the world. I want us to think about that as we those real things as we go on our journey today through Christmas, and keep that in mind. You know, if we're going to rediscover the reality of Christmas, right, a place like this is really, really helpful on one hand, but not so much on the other. Now, here's what I mean by that, is the nativity scene is one of the most iconic images in all the world. I mean, billions of people would recognize that, and we have these represented in our house, right? We have Mary and Joseph and the baby in the manger, maybe the animals around, and we think barn, we think all that kind of thing. And the only problem with it is it's not terribly accurate, but we can't help it, because when we read a story like in a passage like we just read, we bring to it our own habitual imagery, our own culture. And so we see, kind of in movies have helped us do this, right? We see Joseph and Mary, and they've wandered through the streets of Bethlehem, and they see no vacancy signs everywhere, or they knock on doors. They go even to the Motel 6, and there's no room. And then they show up at a bed and breakfast somewhere, and the guy says, well, I don't have any room in here. I tell you what, you can be in the barn outside. And that's where they end up. And that's just been kind of filled our consciousness. And the real thing didn't quite happen that way. So this is not so helpful on one hand, but it is helpful on another. And I'll tell you about that in just a moment. Now, the real thing would have happened something like this. Remember, this was a census. And Joseph, he's going to Bethlehem because that's where his family's from. So almost certainly he would have had extended family already there. And even if he had never met them, he could have identified himself by his background and genealogy. And what's important to know about that part of the world to this day is that hospitality is a huge thing for them. If someone shows up at your door, especially a family member, even a distant cousin, you feel a sense of responsibility, deep responsibility, to make that home like their home and invite them in and give them a place to be and feed them. So that's what would have been going on. Now, the problem is, the census would have made it where there's a whole bunch of people doing that throughout Bethlehem. So this whole idea of no room for them in the inn is what traditional things say, or no room in the guest room. Basically what that means, picture this home that probably would have been made out of stone with some stucco on it, and it would have been built into the side of a hill, kind of a small kind of mountain rocky area. And what they would have done at the back of the house is they would have had a hollowed out place that would have served like a basement and a storage area. And that's where animals would have been kept. But then they would have had their main living area, and then they would have had either a second floor that would have been a guest room. And that's what it's translated in some translations. It says guest room, and that's exactly what it was because of that hospitality thing. It would have been in either upstairs or just an addition. And all it's saying is there's a lot of family members in here, and it's really, really super crowded. And so there's no room up there at shoulder to shoulder. And honestly, if you want privacy, you're gonna have a baby, we can just kind of stick you in this area that's kind of for the basement and for the small farm animals that would have been a part of everybody's life in that kind of culture. And so and Joseph and Mary over there, I was one scholar who spent 30 years living in Middle Eastern countries, talks about this, that it's very similar to this day, that they have a lot of family members in one place, especially in seasons like when everybody converges. But he said also, there's no such thing as privacy in these places. You might as well just get used to the idea that you are going to be crammed in there with family members. So that's actually what's going on. And this idea of a manger, it is a little feeding trough for the animals, but there's like indentions in the floor where that would have been, and she would have naturally placed him in there as a place to be. But just picture this man, a woman, and a baby kind of off in the corner, trying to get as much privacy as they possibly can get in the circumstances, huddled there together in this beautiful first century story of God coming to the earth as a man. Now, I'm sure at this point you're thinking, okay, well, nice little history lesson there and culture, but why does that matter to us? Well, if you go back, there's a couple of things when you learn from the Christmas story at large. And the most important thing, I think, as far as this goes, is the Christmas story throughout is this wonderful mix of the supernatural and the natural. If you haven't been at One Life before this week, what we've been doing, we're now in Luke chapter 2, but we've been in Luke chapter 1. And the way this Christmas story plays out, it starts with supernatural visitations, right? There's messengers coming from heaven, and they need to, like for Mary, she's a virgin, and yes, heaven's gonna have to announce to her that she's pregnant, because otherwise that's impossible, and she knows that. Well, even more so, think about Joseph. He hears that his fiance is pregnant, he needs a heavenly messenger, and he gets one, because it's just how it has to work, right? And so there's this supernatural quality to all of it, and it's coming in the next passage we're gonna read in a moment. Now, the flip side of that, though, is the supernatural messenger shows up, gives the news, but based on what we know, they don't show up again, and they're not in this scene. There's just a man, a woman, and a baby crowded in this family little place, and it's very natural, if you will. I was listening to an interview with Woody Allen, the filmmaker, right? And he's getting in later years, and the interviewer asked him, how would you advise young directors now coming up? And he said, oh, well, here's the thing. He said, first of all, I know you're going to take your art very seriously, and you should, and you're telling these stories, and you're going to be in the middle of making a film, and you're going to take it super serious, and you're going to think, man, this story is so important, and your life's going to fill with anxiety over that and all that. And he said, I get that, but here's what you always got to remember. That you're going to die. And everybody that's working on that film is going to die. And the whole universe is actually going to die because it didn't come from anywhere. It's just a big old thing of molecules and atoms and physical things that it's all going to burn up. And what you're doing really ultimately doesn't matter at all. That's interesting advice, isn't it? Well, why does that matter? Because the Christmas story says something else. It says, it's very important to remember that there's a supernatural part of life that says that there is a God who is personal, who made everything, and He has heavenly messengers. In other words, there's a story that's larger on the outside of our story. And the thing about it is, we all kind of want that to be true. We like to think that our personal stories are important. Well, if there's a larger story that we're all a part of, they are important. But if things are just molecules and atoms shooting around, then they're really not. That all of our little stories are ultimately meaningless. And so the Christmas story matters because of that, because it informs us, it lets us know that our story matters. And it's confirmed there. But here's the flip side of that. Go back to that little peasant home that's crammed with people. And what I love about it is there's not a heavenly messenger at that point. There's Joseph, there's Mary, there's the baby, there's a bunch of relatives. And there's not an angel showing up at that point. There's not an angel showing up every 10 minutes leading up to it. It's just this natural thing that many of you have experienced where a baby has shown up. And there's loud relatives, there's food being passed. No doubt there's people complaining about the census being taken and the taxes that are gonna go up. You know, there's the CNN crowd over here, there's the Fox crowd over here, and there's all the stuff of family, and there's kids running around everywhere. But what's beautiful about that is the God of the universe coming to reveal Himself in this little baby, I think is directly and indirectly affirming the wonder and the beauty of the normal stuff of life. That's important because, you know, I think when we think of spiritual and supernatural, it's easy for us to picture that living life with God is going to be like, if I really was serious about the things of God, I would maybe don a white robe and walk around the woods and pray and things. But this little scene in this little peasant home affirms the beauty of just normal life stuff. In a barn like this, you think about for generations, this is how people lived. It was fairly normal. House out there, barn in the back. It represents kind of life as normal as it gets. Our hands are dirty and there's farm animals and there's just life happening. And that's the beauty of it all, is that this God of the universe, yes, His story is larger and there's supernatural, but it's also the beauty of the natural, found in that little baby that was born on Christmas. So I hope you'll kind of let that inform your soul and your heart as you go through the Christmas season. Picture in your mind the writer of what we just read. It's Luke the physician, and he's an educated man. He's from a larger city in the ancient world, and he's well-traveled. He has this sponsor that sends him out, gives him the ability to go, and what he says, I've gone to carefully investigate all these things, and I've been talking to eyewitnesses, right? And so he would have been able to travel to Bethlehem, which is there now. You can get on a plane tomorrow and go there, and it's been settled for thousands of years. And something you can tell if you read Luke up until this point and even read the rest of his book, you can tell something blew his mind about Jesus' arrival. Something marked him as he went to these places and talked to these people. And I would maintain it was this consistent mixture of the majestic, the stuff of heaven, meeting the mundane of the earth, right? It's so-called normal people. He was talking to peasants. He was talking to shepherds in a little town called Bethlehem. I actually had the privilege of going to Bethlehem many years ago, and one of the things they did for us is they allowed us to go out into fields where there were shepherds watching their flocks. And one of the things that you notice is that, like several cultures throughout the world, it's one of those cultures that hasn't changed hardly at all in hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of years. There's cultures that time leaves behind, and they're kind of that way. And it strikes you at how simple it is. But also, back in their day, the shepherds would have been viewed as not only lower class, but possibly even lower than that, borderline outcast class. And that's why it's so important to see that God gives them this heavenly concert, this majestic thing where He peels back the heavens and He has this announcement made, and there's glory and there's all this kind of language, all this majestic stuff to a group of shepherds. And keep in mind, this wouldn't have been a crowd of shepherds. It wouldn't have been hundreds or thousands of them. It would have been just a handful, maybe at the most a dozen people just standing there watching from their mundane place the majestic unfold. Well, ever since then, that's been the message of Jesus, because that's who He is. He's the combination of the majestic and the mundane, just the simple, the personal. That's why in church architecture throughout the centuries, you see both go back and forth. Some emphasize the majestic, those giant cathedrals. And then there's others that, kind of like One Life, that kind of emphasize the mundane or the accessibility of things more. Now, what I love and respect about this place is it's a good mix of both. But that's what that's communicating, because why that's important to you and I is, in our culture, status is associated with, I would say, significance is related to salary, is related to celebrity, right? Well, if these things were happening in our day, God would bypass that stuff. And He would go to those of us who are so-called the normal people, who don't have necessarily salary, don't have necessarily celebrity. We're just so-called normal people, and He meets us right where we are. Why is that important? Because what that means is that a relationship with the God of the universe is available to you and I, no matter where we come from, no matter our socioeconomic background or our ethnic group. It doesn't make any difference. God is available to us, and that's amazing. And here's another thing to keep in mind. What was their message? When they announced this, they announced a Savior. And why that's so important is that, I've invited a number of people through the years to church. And here's the most common line I hear. I hear it all the time. Oh man, if I showed up there, the place would burn down. People make that joke. And I know they're joking, but what they're revealing, in a sense, is this innate thought that says, when I get into the majestic, if I go to a place like a church, I associate the majestic with the moral. In other words, I know how flawed I am. I know that sometimes on the outside I'm smiling, but inwardly I'm seething. At other times, I know I've hurt people that I love dearly. I know I'm addicted. I know I've envied. In other words, I fall short morally. And that's the beauty of this thing as well, is not only is He not looking at your background, He's looking at that in your life that blocks you from Him. And it's saying, hey, a Savior's been born to you. That stuff has been taken care of, that God has that answer. So come, you can have a relationship with the God of the universe. That's why we worship. That's why we sing. That's why we celebrate Merry Christmas, because the majestic came into the mundane. And I hope you'll take that to heart during this Christmas season.